Welcome to Sleepless Philosophers. Before the ideas begin, a small request: most of you who watch are not subscribed, and we've noticed this in the numbers, in the gap between views and the audience that stays. We post every single day, we put care into each script, each thought, each question that unfolds in the dark, and if these videos have become part of your nights, if they help you think or drift, or simply exist in that space between waking and sleep, consider subscribing, hitting the like button, turning on notifications so you know when the next one arrives. And if you feel moved to do so, leave a comment, tell us where you're watching from. What philosophical question occupies your mind the most? What idea you return to when everything else falls away? These small gestures matter more than you might think. They allow this work to continue. They allow these ideas to reach others like you, scattered across the world, awake in the quiet hours. Now the introduction ends and the philosophy begins. Some ideas are not just dangerous to power, but are dangerous to existence, are not just threatening social order, but are threatening ontological stability, are not just challenging beliefs, but are challenging the structure of being itself, are ideas that when fully grasped, when completely understood, when thoroughly integrated into consciousness, produce not conversion or enlightenment, but erasure, produce the literal disappearance of those who think them, who follow them to their conclusion, who allow the ideas to transform consciousness in ways that eliminate the thinker, that dissolve the boundary between thought and reality in ways that make continued existence impossible. And the impossible is what happened, is what the records show before they were destroyed, before the archives were sealed, before the knowledge was suppressed. Not because it threatened institutions, but because it threatened being, threatened the continued presence of those who understood it, who saw what it revealed, who followed the logic to its endpoint and found that the endpoint was absence, was vanishing, was the ceasing to be that is not death but is something else, is something that leaves no body, no trace, no evidence except the gap where the person was, the empty space where consciousness used to organize reality. And the reality is what these ideas touch, is what they undermine, is what they show to be contingent on consciousness in ways that, when understood, completely cause consciousness to withdraw its support, to stop maintaining the structure, to allow the collapse that is not into death but into non-being, into the state that is not a state, that is not anything because it is the absence of the conditions that make anything possible. And the possible is what these ideas eliminate, is what they show to be dependent on not thinking them, on not understanding them, on maintaining the illusion that being is independent of belief, that existence is objective, that reality persists regardless of consciousness. And the regardless is what the dangerous philosophy denies, is what it shows to be false, is what it demonstrates through argument so compelling, through reasoning so rigorous, through insight so penetrating that those who follow it fully cease to provide the support that their own existence requires, cease to maintain the belief that sustains them, cease to participate in the collective agreement that makes reality real. And the real is what they stop being, is what they withdraw from, is what they are erased from, not by dying but by understanding, not by external force but by internal recognition, not by anything happening to them, but by their ceasing to happen, by their withdrawing the participation that made them exist. And the existing is what stops, is what ends, is what results in disappearance. That is literal, that is complete, that is leaving no body. Because there was never a body in the sense that is usually meant. There was only consciousness organizing sensations into the pattern called body, organizing perceptions into the pattern called world. And when that organizing stops, when that consciousness withdraws, when that participation ends, there is no body to leave behind, no corpse to bury, no physical trace, only the gap, the absence, the space where someone was and then was not. And the not is what remains, is what the evidence shows, is what the witnesses describe before they too understand. before they too follow the reasoning, before they too are erased by the philosophy that is too dangerous to think, too powerful to contain, too true to refute. And the refutation is what is needed, is what authorities attempted, is what scholars tried to provide. But the refutation requires understanding the argument, requires following the reasoning, requires thinking the thoughts, and the thinking is what causes the disappearance, is what produces the erasure, is what makes the philosophy dangerous not to society but to being, and being is what is at stake, is what the philosophy threatens, is what those who understand it cease to maintain, and the cessation is immediate, is total, is leaving no trace except the memory in others who did not fully understand, who stopped short of complete comprehension, who pulled back from the final step. And the step is what the censored chapter describes, is what was removed from every ethics textbook, is what was found to produce not moral transformation, but ontological dissolution, not changed behaviour, but disappeared persons. And the persons who disappeared were not killed, were not removed by force, were not eliminated by authorities, but simply ceased to be there, ceased to occupy space, ceased to organise reality, ceased to participate in existence. And the existence is. What requires participation is what depends on consciousness, maintaining belief, maintaining engagement, maintaining the structures that make being possible. And when those structures are withdrawn, when that maintenance stops, when that participation ends, there is no being, there is no presence, there is only absence, and the absence is what remains when someone thinks the dangerous thought, understands the forbidden idea, follows the reasoning to its conclusion. And the conclusion is not death but is erasure, is not ending but is never having been, is the withdrawal from existence that leaves no evidence except the gap, the space, the absence where someone was, and the was becomes uncertain, becomes questionable. Because if someone ceases to exist completely, ceases to have existed at all, then the memories of them become suspect, become unreliable, become the only trace of something that might not have happened. And the happening is what becomes uncertain, is what the philosophy undermines, is what it shows to depend on belief, on agreement, on the collective maintenance of narrative. And when one consciousness withdraws, when one participant stops maintaining, the others feel the gap. Notice the absence. Remember something that is no longer supported by reality. And the reality is what adjusts, is what fills in the gap, is what eliminates the traces, is what makes it as if the person never was. And the never was is the final stage, is what happens after the initial disappearance, is the completion of the erasure, is the adjustment of reality to the absence, is the closing of the gap, is the collective forgetting that is not intentional but is structural, is the result of reality being maintained by agreement, by consensus, by the collective participation of consciousness. And when one consciousness withdraws, the structure adjusts, the pattern reforms, the absence is absorbed, and what remains is less than memory, is less than trace, is the vague sense that something is missing, something is wrong, something has changed, but the what is inaccessible is already fading, is already being absorbed into the adjustment, and the adjustment is complete, is total, is making it as if the disappeared never existed, never participated, never contributed to the maintenance of reality. And the reality is what continues, is what persists, is what remains. After the erasure, but the remains is less, is diminished, is showing the gap to those who know to look, who understand what has been lost, who remember what the adjustment is erasing, and the erasure is ongoing, is continuous, is the fate of those who think the dangerous thought, who understand the forbidden philosophy, who follow the reasoning to its conclusion, and the conclusion is disappearance, is erasure, is the ceasing to be that is not death but is ontological withdrawal, is the stopping of participation, is the ending of the maintenance that made existence possible. And the possible is what these people are no longer, is what they cease to be, is what they withdraw from by understanding too much, by seeing too clearly, by recognizing the contingency that makes being dependent on not seeing, on not understanding, on maintaining the illusion that existence is objective, that reality is independent, that being is not requiring constant support. And the support is what consciousness provides, is what participation maintains, is what the collective agreement enforces. And when one withdraws, when one sees through, when one understands the philosophy that makes people disappear, the withdrawal is automatic, is inevitable, is the structural result of understanding, and the understanding cannot be undone, cannot be forgotten, cannot be suppressed once achieved. And the achieving is what causes the disappearance, is what produces the erasure, is what makes the philosophy dangerous. And the dangerous is why it was banned, why it was censored, why the chapter was removed, why the philosophers vanished, why the knowledge was suppressed. Not because it threatened institutions, but because it threatened being. Not because it challenged authority, but because it challenged existence. Not because it was false, but because it was too true, was revealing what must remain hidden, was exposing the dependence that must be denied, was showing the contingency that must be suppressed. And the suppression is what authorities attempted, is what the banning achieved, is what the censorship maintained. But the knowledge persists, is waiting, is available to those who seek it, who find the fragments, who reconstruct the argument, who follow the reasoning. And the following is what produces the disappearance, is what causes the erasure, is what makes those who understand vanish, not into death, but into absence, not into somewhere else, but into nowhere, not into another state, but into the cessation of states, into the withdrawal from being that is not non-being, but is the ending of the distinction, is the collapse of the boundary, is the recognition that being requires participation, and that participation can be withdrawn. And the withdrawing is what happens, is what the philosophy produces, is what those who understand fully cannot avoid, because the understanding is transformation, is alteration of consciousness in ways that make continued participation impossible, that make maintenance of existence unavoidable, that make the withdrawal automatic. And the automatic is what makes it dangerous, is what makes it spread, is what makes it necessary to suppress, because those who partially understand become dangerous to others, become carriers of fragments that if combined could produce the full understanding, could cause more disappearances, could threaten the collective maintenance that makes reality real. And the real is what depends on not understanding, on not thinking certain thoughts, on not following certain arguments, on stopping short of certain conclusions. And the conclusions are what the censored chapter reached, is what the disappeared philosophers understood, is what the dangerous philosophy contains, is what makes thinking it produce erasure, produce disappearance, produce the vanishing that is not death but is ontological withdrawal, is the ceasing to participate, is the ending of maintenance, is the stopping of the support that consciousness provides. To being, and being is what ends, is what those who think the dangerous thought cease to maintain, cease to be part of, cease to exist within. And the within is what they withdraw from, is what they cease to support, is what they allow to collapse for themselves. And the collapsing is their disappearance, is their erasure, is their vanishing. And the vanishing is complete, is total, is leaving no trace, no body, no evidence, only the gap, only the absence, only the space where someone was and then was not. And the not is what remains, is what the dangerous philosophy produces, is what thinking it creates, is what understanding it causes. And the causing is automatic, is inevitable, is the structural result of comprehension, and comprehension is what produces disappearance, produces erasure, produces the vanishing that is not death but is ontological suicide, is the withdrawal from existence through understanding, is the ceasing to be through recognition, is the disappearance that happens when consciousness understands that being depends on not understanding, that existence requires ignorance, that reality is maintained through participation that can be withdrawn, and the withdrawing is what happens, is what the philosophy causes, is what makes it dangerous, is what makes it banned, is what makes people disappear, and disappearing is what those who think it do, is what those who understand it become, is what those who follow it to its conclusion achieve, which is not enlightenment but is erasure, is not transcendence but is vanishing, is not liberation but is disappearance, is the ceasing to be, that is literal, that is complete, that is the result of understanding the philosophy that was banned because it made people disappear. And disappearing is what it does, is what it causes, is what makes it the most dangerous idea, the most forbidden knowledge, the philosophy that breaks reality, that causes ontological suicide, that produces erasure through understanding. And understanding is what causes disappearance, is what makes people vanish, is what the banned philosophy does, and doing is what it continues to do, is what it will always do. To those who think it, who understand it, who follow it to its conclusion, and the conclusion is disappearance, is erasure, is vanishing, is the ending of being through understanding, is ontological suicide through philosophy, is the dangerous thought that makes people disappear. And disappearing is what happens, is what the philosophy causes, is what makes it banned, is what makes it dangerous, is what makes it the philosophy that was banned because it made people disappear. And disappear they did, and disappear they will. Those who think it, those who understand it, those who follow the reasoning to its conclusion. And the conclusion is absence, is vanishing, is erasure, is disappearance. And disappearance is what the philosophy causes, is what makes it banned, is what makes it dangerous, is the philosophy that makes people disappear. And disappear is what they do, is what understanding causes, is what the dangerous thought produces, is disappearance, is erasure, is vanishing, is the ending through. Understanding is the philosophy that was banned because it made people disappear. The suffering is not in having little, but in having less. Not in lacking, but in being surpassed. Not in absence, but in comparison. And comparison is constant, is unavoidable, is built into perception, into cognition, into the social architecture of human life. Because humans are not isolated processes of absolute value, but are deeply embedded in networks where worth is relative, where position matters more than possession, where status is the thing being tracked, being measured, being fought over, and the fighting is exhausting, is endless, is producing anxiety that has no clear source except the presence of others, the visibility of their achievements, their possessions, their apparent happiness. And the apparent is what matters, is what comparison operates on. Because comparison does not have access to internal states, cannot measure actual satisfaction or genuine contentment, can only measure signals, displays, the external markers that are supposed to indicate success. And success is not absolute, is not a threshold that once crossed brings lasting peace, but is relative, is defined against the success of others, is meaningful only in context, only in relationship, only as position in a hierarchy that has no natural endpoints, no place where more is impossible, no level where comparison stops. And the stopping is what never happens, is what cannot happen, because there is always someone higher, always someone with more, always someone whose position makes one's own position feel insufficient, feel like failure, feel like falling behind. And behind is where comparison places everyone, except the very top, except the singular position that by definition only one can occupy. And even that position is temporary, is unstable, is vulnerable to being surpassed, to losing the lead, to falling back into the mass of strivers who are all measuring themselves against the same unreachable standard. And the unreachable is what drives the system, is what keeps everyone running, keeps everyone comparing, keeps everyone suffering from the gap between where they are and where they see others, where they imagine others, where the displays and signals suggest others have arrived, and the arrival is illusion, is performance, is the curated presentation that social media perfects, that makes comparison more toxic than ever before. Because the comparison is now constant, is now unavoidable, is now the default activity of any moment with a screen. And the screen shows the highlight reel, shows the best moments, the peak experiences, the carefully selected and filtered images that are meant to represent lives, but are really representing brands, representing the performance of success. And the performance is what gets compared against reality, against the unfiltered experience of one's own life, with all its ordinariness, all its mundane moments, all the time that is not photogenic, not shareable, not worth displaying. And the asymmetry creates distortion, creates the sense that everyone else is doing better, is happier, is more successful, is living the life that one should be living, but is not. And the not is experienced as personal failure, as inadequacy, as evidence that something is wrong with the self, when really what is wrong is the comparison, is the measuring of internal experience against external display, of reality against performance, of the whole of one's life against the curated fragments of others' lives. And the fragments are not representative, are not honest, are not revealing the struggles, the doubts, the failures that are also present but are edited out, are kept private, are not part of the display. And so the display creates impossible standards, creates the sense that success should be constant, that happiness should be visible, that worth should be demonstrable. And demonstrable means comparable, means measurable against others, means existing in the public space where position can be assessed, where rank can be assigned, where the hierarchy becomes visible. And the visibility is what social media provides, is what makes the panopticon complete, is what ensures that everyone is always being watched, always being measured, always being compared, not by a central authority, but by everyone else, by the distributed surveillance of the network, where every post is a signal, every image is a claim, every update is a statement of position, and the position is what matters, is what gets evaluated, is what determines worth in the social economy, where attention is currency and visibility is power, and power is zero-sum, is rivalrous, is gained by some at the expense of others, because attention is finite, is limited, is allocated according to comparison, according to who is most interesting, most successful, most worth watching. And the worth watching is what everyone is competing for, is what drives the performance, is what makes authenticity impossible. Because authenticity does not optimize for attention, does not maximize engagement, does not win the comparison, and winning is what the system demands, is what the architecture incentivizes, is what the algorithms reward. And the rewards go to those who perform best, who display most effectively, who signal status most clearly, and the clarity is achieved through excess, through conspicuous consumption, through the demonstration of resources, of connections, of experiences that others do not have. And the not having is what makes the display valuable, is what makes it worth envying, is what triggers the comparison that produces the anxiety that drives more performance, more display, more competition. And the competition is the prison, is the trap, is the system that has no exit, because exiting means becoming invisible, means losing position, means falling behind. And behind is unbearable, is the failure state, is where the losers are. And no one wants to be a loser. No one wants to be the one who is surpassed, who is left behind, who is forgotten. And the forgetting is what happens to those who stop performing, who stop displaying, who drop out of the comparison. And dropping out is not freedom but is erasure, is not peace but is irrelevance, is not escape but is defeat. And so most stay in, most keep performing, most keep comparing, most keep suffering from the gap between where they are and where they see others. And the seeing is continuous, is unavoidable, is the default state of consciousness. In an environment where everyone's position is visible, where everyone's success is displayed, where everyone's life is performance and the performance is what gets internalized, becomes the standard against which the self is measured. And the measuring is constant, is automatic, is happening at every moment, in every context, whenever others are present, or even when they are not present but are represented, are visible through screens, through feeds, through the endless stream of signals that constitute social media. And social media is the panopticon perfected, is the prison where everyone is guard and prisoner simultaneously, is watching and being watched, is judging and being judged, is comparing and being compared. And the comparing is the punishment, is the suffering, is the anxiety that has no clear cause except the presence of others, the visibility of their position, the evidence that they have what one does not have, and the not having is experienced as deprivation, as relative deprivation, as the sense that one is lacking not in absolute terms but in comparison to others, and the comparison is the only terms that matter, is the only measurement that counts. Because humans are social, are tribal, are wired to care about position, about rank, about where they stand in the hierarchy. And the hierarchy is not natural, is not fixed, is not based on any inherent quality, but is constructed through comparison, through the constant evaluation of signals, of displays, of the markers that are supposed to indicate worth. And worth is not intrinsic, is not internal, is not a property of the self, but is assigned, is determined by others, is the result of comparison, of measurement, of the social process that ranks everyone according to criteria that are arbitrary, that are culturally specific, that are manipulable. And the manipulation is what social media enables, is what allows anyone to perform success, to display status, to signal position regardless of underlying reality. And the reality is hidden, is private, is not part of the comparison. And so the comparison is always distorted, is always measuring performance against performance, display against display, rather than reality against reality. And the reality is that most people are struggling, are anxious, are feeling inadequate, are suffering from the same comparison that they are inflicting on others, and the inflicting is not intentional, is not malicious, is just participation, is just performing, is just displaying the signals that are required to maintain position, to avoid falling behind, to stay in the game. And the game is the prison, is the system that has no winners, because there is no end point, no level of success that brings peace, no amount of status that ends comparison, because comparison is relative, is always finding someone higher, always finding new metrics, always raising the bar, and the raising is what makes enough impossible, is what ensures that satisfaction is temporary, is what converts every achievement into baseline, into the new normal that is no longer impressive, no longer enviable, no longer worth displaying because everyone else has caught up, has matched the signal, has equaled the performance, and so new signals are needed, new displays are required, new forms of status must be pursued, and the pursuit is endless, is exhausting, is producing the anxiety that characterizes modern life, the sense that one is always falling behind, always insufficient, always failing to measure up. And the measuring up is the problem, is the trap, is the prison, because up is infinite, is unlimited, is always higher than wherever one currently is. And so the climbing never ends, never reaches a summit, never arrives at a place where comparison stops, where enough is recognized as enough, where peace is possible, and peace is not possible as long as comparison continues, as long as others are visible, as long as position matters, and position always matters, is wired into human psychology, is part of the social brain that evolved to track status, to monitor hierarchy, to care intensely about where one stands relative to others, and the relative is the only measure that counts, is the only information that the social brain processes, is why absolute improvements in living standards do not produce corresponding improvements in happiness. Because happiness is relative, is determined by comparison, is about position not possession, and position is zero-sum, is gained by some at the expense of others, is the ranking that ensures most people feel inadequate most of the time. Because most people are not at the top, are not in the elite positions, are somewhere in the middle or the bottom, are below someone, are being surpassed by someone, are losing the comparison to someone, and the someone is always visible, is always present, is always there to trigger the anxiety, to produce the envy, to create the suffering that comes from measuring oneself against others and finding oneself lacking. And the lacking is not real, is not objective, is only relative, is only meaningful in comparison. But the comparison is what makes it feel real, what makes it feel like failure, what makes it feel like something is wrong, something needs to change, something must be improved. And the improvement is pursued, is worked toward, is achieved. And the achievement brings temporary satisfaction, brings a brief moment of feeling successful, of feeling adequate, of feeling like enough. But the enough is temporary, is quickly replaced by new comparison, by new awareness of those who are higher, who have more, who have surpassed. And the surpassing is the trigger, is what resets the baseline, is what converts achievement into inadequacy, is what makes the prison inescapable. Because escaping requires not just achieving more, but achieving more than everyone else. And everyone else is also striving, is also comparing, is also trying to escape through achievement. And so the competition intensifies, the standards rise, the bar keeps moving, and the moving is what makes peace impossible, makes satisfaction temporary, makes enough unattainable, because enough is not an absolute measure, but is relative, is defined by comparison, is determined by position, and position is always vulnerable, is always threatened, is always at risk of being lost. And the risk creates anxiety, creates vigilance, creates the constant monitoring of others, of their signals, of their displays, of any evidence that they're gaining, advancing, surpassing, and the surpassing is what must be prevented, is what drives the performance, is what makes rest impossible, makes dropping out unthinkable, makes the prison unescapable, except by those rare individuals who somehow break free of comparison, who somehow stop measuring themselves against others, who somehow find peace in their own position, regardless of where that position is in the hierarchy. And these individuals are rare, are exceptions, are not the norm, because the norm is comparison, is the constant measurement, is the anxiety that comes from always being aware of others, of their position, of their apparent success. And the apparent is what matters, is what the social brain responds to, is what triggers the envy. And envy is information, is the signal that someone else has something valuable, something worth having, something that could improve one's own position. And the position is what envy is tracking, is what it is designed to make salient, is the gap that needs closing. And the closing is pursued through imitation, through acquisition, through the striving to match what the envied other has, to equal their position, to eliminate the gap. But the gap never closes, is never eliminated, because as soon as one gap is closed, another opens. As soon as one person is matched, another surpasses. As soon as one goal is achieved, the goalposts move, and the moving is what makes the prison permanent, makes the suffering chronic, makes the anxiety inescapable, because the architecture of social comparison is not designed for peace, is not optimized for satisfaction, is designed for striving, for competition, for the endless pursuit of position. And the pursuit is the function, is what the system needs, is what makes the hierarchy dynamic, what keeps people climbing, what ensures that those at the top are always being challenged, always being pursued, always at risk of being overtaken. And the risk is what makes their position valuable, is what makes status worth having, is what creates the scarcity that makes position meaningful. And meaningful means enviable, means desirable, means worth suffering for. And the suffering is universal, is experienced at every level, is not limited to those at the bottom, but is felt even at the top. Because even at the top there is comparison, There is the awareness of others who are close, who are threatening, who might surpass, and the might creates anxiety, creates the need to defend position, to maintain distance, to keep performing, keep displaying, keep signaling status, and the signaling is exhausting, is requiring constant effort, constant vigilance, constant awareness of how one is being perceived, how one is being measured, how one's position is being evaluated by others who are always comparing, always measuring, always judging, and the judging is mutual, is reciprocal, is everyone evaluating everyone else, is the distributed surveillance that makes the panopticon total, that makes escape impossible, that ensures everyone is always in the prison, always being compared, always suffering from the awareness that others are watching, measuring, judging, and that the judgment might be negative, might find one lacking, might assign a lower position than one wants, than one deserves, than one has worked for. And the work is never enough, is never sufficient, is never achieving the permanent security that would allow rest, would allow peace, would allow the comparison to stop mattering. Because the comparison never stops mattering, is always relevant, is always the measure that counts, is what determines worth in the social economy, where position is everything, where rank is identity, where hierarchy is reality, and reality is constructed through comparison, through the constant measurement that assigns everyone a place, a position, a rank. And the rank is always provisional, always temporary, always vulnerable to change, to being surpassed, to falling, and the falling is what everyone fears, is what drives the anxiety, is what makes the prison work. Because the prison is not a place, but is a process, is the constant comparison that measures everyone against everyone else and finds everyone lacking, because lacking is relative, is inevitable, is the necessary result of a system where only one can be first, where most must be middle, where someone must be last and the last is where no one wants to be, is the position that is avoided, that is fled from, that creates the most anxiety, the most suffering, the most desperate striving to escape. And the escape is pursued through the same means that created the prison, through comparison, through performance, through display, through the signaling of status that is supposed to improve position, but only reinforces the system, only strengthens the prison, only ensures that comparison continues, that measurement persists, that the anxiety remains, and the remaining is permanent, is chronic, is the condition of social existence in an environment where everyone is visible, where position is trackable, where comparison is unavoidable. And the unavoidable is what makes the suffering universal, is what ensures that peace is rare, that satisfaction is temporary, that enough is never enough, because enough is not absolute but is relative, is determined by comparison, is defined by position, and position is always being measured, always being evaluated, always being compared, and the comparison is the prison, is the trap, is the source of suffering that has no solution except the impossible one of stopping comparison, of ceasing to measure oneself against others, of finding worth that is internal rather than relative, that is intrinsic rather than assigned, that is independent of position, independent of rank, independent of the hierarchy that comparison creates and maintains, and the maintenance is collective, is everyone participating, everyone contributing, everyone reinforcing the system by comparing, by displaying, by performing, by caring about position, and the caring is what makes the prison work, is what keeps everyone trapped, is what ensures that suffering continues, that anxiety persists, that peace remains impossible as long as comparison continues, as long as others are visible, as long as position matters, and position will always matter, will always be salient, will always be the measure that counts. Because humans are social, are hierarchical, are wired to care about rank, about status, about where they stand relative to others, and the relative is the only measurement that has ever mattered, is the only comparison that counts, Is the prison that has no walls but is inescapable? Is the trap that has no lock but cannot be opened? Is the suffering that has no cause except comparison, except the presence of others, except the visibility of their position? And the position is always visible, is always present, is always there to measure against, to fall short of, to suffer from the awareness that someone is higher, someone has more, someone is better. And the better is what one is not, is what one is lacking, is what the comparison reveals. And the revealing is the suffering, is the prison, is the condition that cannot be escaped as long as comparison continues, and comparison will continue, must continue, is built into the architecture of social existence, is the foundation of the hierarchy, is the mechanism that assigns position. And position is everything, is worth, is identity, is the measure of the self, and the self is always being measured, always being compared, always being found insufficient. And the insufficient is the prison, is the trap, is the suffering that is universal, that is inescapable, that is the cost of being social, of being visible, of being in comparison with others. And the comparison is the prison, and the prison is where everyone lives, where everyone suffers, where peace is impossible and enough is never enough. Language pretends to capture the world, pretends to translate experience into symbols that can be shared, but the translation is always incomplete, is always leaving something behind, something essential that resists being put into words, and this resistance is not a failure of vocabulary, not a problem that could be solved by inventing new terms or refining definitions, but is structural, is built into the nature of language itself, into the gap between the thing and the word for the thing, between the experience and the description of the experience. And this gap is not empty, but is filled with silence, with the ineffable, with everything that can be shown but not said, felt but not expressed, known but not communicated. And the knowing that cannot be communicated is most of what matters, is the substance of experience, is the raw sensation of being alive, of being conscious, of existing as this particular point of awareness at this particular moment. And no arrangement of words can convey this, can make someone else feel what is felt, can bridge the gap between one consciousness and another, because words are public, are shared, are defined by use and convention, while experience is private, is immediate, is defined by the perspective from which it arises, and perspectives cannot be shared, can only be described, and description is always external, is always at a remove, is always pointing towards something rather than presenting it. And the pointing is all that language can do, is the limit of what symbols can achieve. And the limit is reached quickly, is encountered as soon as one tries to say what anything is really like, what it feels like from the inside, what quality it has that makes it this experience rather than that experience. And the thisness cannot be said, can only be shown, can only be gestured toward, and the gesture is not the thing, is not a substitute, is only an indication that there is something there, something beyond the words, something in the silence beneath language. And the silence is not absence, but presence, is not the lack of sound, but the space where meaning lives before it is forced into form, before it is compressed into sentences, before it is reduced to the linearity of speech. And speech is linear, is one word after another, is sequential, is bound by time. While experience is simultaneous, is layered, is happening all at once in ways that cannot be captured by the march of syllables. And the march misses the music, misses the texture, misses the way that experience is not composed of discrete elements that can be named separately, but is a continuous flow that is divided by language into artificial units. And the units are useful, are necessary for communication, for thought, for the organization of experience into manageable pieces. But the organization is a lie, is a convenience, is the imposition of structure onto something that has no structure, or has a structure so complex, so multidimensional, that it cannot be mapped onto the one-dimensional track of language, and the track is narrow, is constraining, is forcing everything to line up, to follow rules, to fit into grammar, and grammar is a cage, is a set of requirements that limit what can be said, how it can be said, what relationships can be expressed, and the relationships in experience are not grammatical, are not subject-verb-object, are not causal in the simple sense that language demands, are more like music, more like the way that notes relate to each other, not through logic, but through resonance, through harmony, through the ineffable rightness of certain combinations. And rightness is not a property that can be defined, can only be recognized, can only be felt. And the feeling is what language cannot capture, is what remains in the silence, is what is lost when experience is translated into words, and the loss is total, is not a matter of degree but of kind, because words and experience are different types of things, are operating in different domains, and the attempt to convert one into the other is like trying to describe colour to someone who has never seen, and the description can list properties, can talk about wavelength and frequency, can use metaphors, can compare it to other experiences, but none of this conveys what colour is, what it is like to see red, and the like is the problem, is the word that points to the gap, to the subjective quality that cannot be communicated, can only be experienced. And experiencing is not communicating, is not sharing, is not the public act that language performs, but is the private act that language can only gesture toward. And the gesture is clumsy, is inadequate, is using blunt instruments to point at something delicate, something subtle, something that disappears. When focused on too directly, when examined too closely, when forced into the harsh light of explicit statement, and explicit is what language demands, is what words require, is the naming of things, the drawing of boundaries, the making of distinctions, and distinctions are violence, are cuts, are the separation of what is continuous into discrete parts, and the parts are not the whole. Cannot be reassembled into the whole, because the relationships between parts are not the same as the parts themselves, and language can name the parts but cannot capture the relationships except through more words, more parts. And the regress is infinite, is never arriving at the thing itself, is always operating at a remove, in the space of representation rather than the space of presence. And presence is what is lost, is what words cannot hold, because words are abstract, are general, are applying to many instances rather than this instance, this particular moment, this unique occurrence that has never happened before and will never happen again. And the never again is what makes experience precious, is what gives it weight, is what makes the silence beneath language so full, so rich, so irreducibly important, because the silence is where the particular lives, where the unrepeatable exists, where the singular moment is happening. And language can only speak in universals, in categories, in types, and types are not tokens, are not the actual things, but the classes that actual things are sorted into. And the sorting is useful, but is also destructive, is losing the individuality, the specificity, the exact quality that makes this thing what it is. And what it is cannot be said, can only be pointed to. And the pointing is metaphor, is analogy, is the attempt to convey the unknown through the known, the ineffable through the effable, and the attempt always fails, is always inadequate because the known is not the unknown. The metaphor is not the thing, is only similar, only resembling, only sharing some properties while lacking others, and the lacking is what matters, is what makes the difference, is what remains unsaid in the space between the metaphor and the meaning. And the space is where poetry lives, where art lives, where music lives, because these are the forms that acknowledge the failure of literal language, that work in the silence, that use words or sounds or images not to say, but to show, not to define, but to evoke, not to capture, but to suggest. And suggestion is not statement, is not the bold claim that this is what it is, but is the tentative offering that maybe it is something like this. Maybe if you attend to this pattern, this rhythm, this arrangement, you will feel something similar to what I felt. And the feeling is the goal, is what art aims for, is the communication not of information, but of experience. And the communication is never complete, is never total, is always leaving room for interpretation, for the receiver to bring their own experience, their own associations, their own silence to fill in what the words or notes or images cannot say. And the cannot say is most of it, is the majority of what is being communicated, is happening in the spaces between words, in the pauses between notes, in the negative space around the image. And these spaces are not empty, but are full, are where meaning accumulates, where resonance happens, where the ineffable makes itself felt without ever being named. And naming is the death of the ineffable, is the attempt to drag it into language, to make it explicit, to pin it down, and the pinning kills it, turns it into something else, something smaller, something manageable, but also something false. Because the ineffable is not manageable, is not controllable, is not subject to the will, is only encountered, only experienced, only allowed to happen. And the allowing is what silence does, is what the spaces between words permit, is the acknowledgement that there is more than can be said, that language is not everything, that meaning exists in the pre-linguistic, in the non-verbal, in the realm that infants inhabit before they learn to speak. And learning to speak is learning to lose something, is gaining the ability to communicate, but losing the directness of experience, the unmediated encounter with the world. And the mediation is what language provides, is what symbols do. They stand between the self and the world, between experience and consciousness. And the standing between is interpretation, is the conversion of raw sensation into meaningful categories. And the categories are necessary for thought, for memory, for the organization of experience into narratives. But they are also barriers, are obstacles, are preventing direct contact with what is actually happening. And what is actually happening is ineffable, is beyond language, is in the realm of pure qualia, of raw feeling, of the what it is like that resists all attempts to be captured in words. And the resistance is not stubbornness, but impossibility, is not a challenge to be overcome, but a limit to be accepted. And accepting the limit is what Wittgenstein meant when he said that what can be shown cannot be said, that there are truths that can only be displayed, only demonstrated, only lived. And the living is the showing, is the way that meaning manifests in action, in gesture, in the way a life is shaped. And the shaping is not describable, is not reducible to rules or principles or propositions, is only visible in the particular, in the concrete, in the specific way that this person moved through the world. And the moving cannot be captured in biography, cannot be preserved in narrative, because narrative is selection, is choosing which moments to include and which to leave out. And what is left out is most of it, is the ordinary, the unremarkable, the moments that do not fit into story. And these moments are where life actually happens, are where experience is most dense, most rich, most full of the qualities that make it worth living. But they are also most resistant to language, most stubbornly ineffable, most insistent on remaining in the silence. And the silence is not the enemy of meaning, but its ground, is the space from which meaning emerges, is the background against which words appear. And without the background, the words have no context, no resonance, no way to mean more than they literally say. And literal meaning is thin, is insufficient, is the bare minimum of what language can do. And what language can do is not impressive when compared to what experience is, when measured against the fullness of consciousness, against the complexity of a single moment of awareness, which contains more information, more nuance, more texture than could be expressed in a lifetime of speech, and the lifetime would not be enough, would never catch up, would always be lagging behind the present moment, describing what has passed rather than what is passing. And the passing is too quick, is too fluid, is too continuous to be caught in the discrete net of words. And the net has holes, has gaps, as spaces through which most of experience escapes, and the escaping is not loss but necessity, is not failure, but the acknowledgement that language is a tool, is an instrument, is good for certain purposes, but not for all purposes, and the purposes it is not good for include the most important ones. Include the communication of what it feels like to be alive, to be conscious, to be the experiencing subject rather than the experienced object. And the subject is ineffable, is beyond language, is what looks out from behind the eyes but cannot be captured in description, cannot be made into object without ceasing to be subject. And the ceasing is what happens when language tries to grasp consciousness, tries to make it explicit, tries to say what the self is, and the self dissolves under scrutiny, becomes elusive, becomes nothing that can be pinned down. And the pinning down is what language wants to do, is what definition aims for, is the fixing of meaning, the stabilization of reference, the establishment of clear boundaries. But consciousness has no clear boundaries, bleeds into the world, into the body, into the past and future. And the bleeding is what makes it alive, what makes it dynamic, what makes it impossible to freeze into the static forms that language provides. And the forms are useful, are necessary, are what allow communication, but they are also prisons, are constraints, are limiting what can be thought, what can be imagined, what can be experienced, because experience that cannot be named is harder to remember, harder to think about, harder to integrate into the narrative of the self. And the narrative is what the self is the story told in language. But the story is not the self, is not the experiencing, is only the account given after the fact, the retrospective interpretation, the organization of memory into coherent form. And the coherence is imposed, is not discovered, is the work of language forcing experience into structure, into sequence, into causality. And causality is not in experience, is not felt, is only inferred, is the story told about why one thing followed another. But the following is not experienced as causality, is experienced as succession, as one thing and then another thing. And the and then is not because, is not explanation, is just the temporal order. And the order is all that is given, all that is directly experienced, and everything else is interpretation, is language filling in the gaps, making connections, building narratives. And the narratives are necessary, are what make life make sense, but they are also false, are always false, because they are simplifications, are reductions, are taking the overwhelming complexity of experience and compressing it into the manageable linearity of story. And story is not experience, is not the living, but the telling, and the telling is always after, is always too late, is always missing the immediacy, the presence, the nowness of experience, and the nowness cannot be said, can only be lived, can only be here, in this moment, in the silence beneath language where everything is happening that words can never capture, never hold, never preserve, because words are time-bound, are sequential, are passing as soon as they are spoken, while experience is timeless, is eternal in the sense of being always now, always present, never past or future, but only this, and this cannot be said, can only be shown, and the showing is what happens when language stops, when the attempt to describe gives way to silence, when the acknowledgement is made that there is nothing more to say, because what needs to be communicated is not in the words, but in the space they create, in the resonance they leave behind, in the way they point beyond themselves to something that cannot be named, but only felt, only recognized, only known in the direct encounter. And the encounter is what matters, is what language is trying to facilitate, is what all the words are aiming toward, the moment when meaning transfers not through symbols but through presence, through the showing rather than the saying, through the silence that is full rather than empty, through the space beneath language where experience lives and words cannot reach. And the not reaching is not failure, but is the nature of things, is the way that consciousness and language exist in different domains, operate on different principles, serve different purposes, and the purposes do not align, do not overlap except at the edges, and the edges are where poetry happens, where music happens, where art happens. In the borderland between the sayable and the unsayable, between the explicit and the implicit, between the word and the silence is not the opposite of language, but its foundation, is the ground from which words emerge and to which they return, is the space that holds everything that cannot be said but only shown, only felt, only known in the living. And the living is what happens here, in this moment, in the silence beneath language where meaning is not constructed but is simply present, is simply here, is simply this, and this is all there is, all there ever was, all there ever will be, and it cannot be said, can never be said, will never be said, because it is not the kind of thing that words can hold, is not reducible to symbols, is not translatable into the public language of communication, is only available in the private silence of experience, and the experience is incommunicable, is irreducibly private, is locked inside the perspective from which it arises, and the locking is not a problem, but a fact, is not something to be overcome, but something to be accepted, and accepting it is what allows language to be used without expecting too much from it, without demanding that it do what it cannot do, which is to say, everything, to capture everything, to make everything explicit, because everything cannot be made explicit, can only be shown, and the showing is what happens in the silence, in the spaces between words, in the pauses that are not empty but full, full of everything that language leaves behind, everything that resists being said, everything that remains ineffable. And the ineffable is not a lack but a richness, is not what is missing but what is present, is the substance of experience that words can only point toward, can only gesture at, can only acknowledge without capturing. And the acknowledgement is enough, is all that can be asked, is the recognition that there is more, always more than can be said, more than can be thought, more than can be communicated, and the more is in the silence, is beneath language, is where meaning lives when it is not being forced into form, when it is not being compressed into sentences, when it is allowed to simply be, to exist without explanation, without definition, without the violence of naming. And the violence is what language does, is what words require, is the cutting up of experience into pieces. And the pieces are not the whole, cannot be the whole, because the whole is continuous, is undivided, is the seamless flow of consciousness that cannot be broken without being destroyed. And the destruction is what language performs, is the necessary sacrifice that communication demands, is the price of being able to share anything at all, but the sharing is always partial, is always leaving the most important part behind, leaving it in the silence where it belongs, where it is safe from the distortions of language, where it remains ineffable, unnameable, unsayable, and the unsayable is everything that matters, is everything that makes life worth living, is everything that cannot be communicated but only lived, and the living is what happens in the silence, in the space beneath language, in the moments when words stop and presence begins, and the beginning is what language can never capture, because it is always arriving after, always describing what has already happened, what has already passed, what is already gone, and the gone is where language lives, in the past, in the memory, in the reconstruction, while experience lives in the present, in the now, in the immediate, and the immediate is ineffable, is beyond words, is in the silence, and the silence is full, is rich, is the ground of everything, is what holds all meaning before it is spoken, all truth before it is said, all experience before it is described, and the before is where it is most real, most alive, most itself, and language can never reach it, can only point toward it, can only acknowledge that there is something there, something in the silence beneath language, something that can be shown but never said, and the showing is all there is all that matters, is the only way that meaning can be transmitted. Not through words, but through the presence that words evoke. Not through saying, but through the silence that saying creates, and the creation is what language is for, is what words are doing when they're used well, creating space for the ineffable, making room for the silence, acknowledging the limits, accepting that what cannot be said is more important than what can. And what can be said is only the frame, only the pointer, only the gesture toward what lies beneath, what lives in the silence, what remains forever beyond the reach of words. History is told as a story of improvement, of movement from darkness toward light, from ignorance toward knowledge, from savagery toward civilization. And this story is so deeply embedded in modern consciousness that questioning it feels like madness, feels like denying the obvious, like rejecting the evidence that surrounds us in the form of technology, medicine, institutions, all the apparatus that makes contemporary life safer, longer, more comfortable than life in previous centuries. But the story is a story, is a narrative constructed retrospectively, is an interpretation imposed on events that could be read differently, could be organized into different patterns, could reveal trajectories other than progress. And the other trajectories are visible once the mythology is recognized as mythology. Once the belief in linear improvement is seen as belief rather than fact, as framework rather than discovery, as one way of organizing time among many possible ways, and the ways that are not chosen are the ones where time is cyclical, where history repeats, where civilizations rise and fall in patterns that suggest not progress, but oscillation, not improvement, but alternation between order and chaos, between flourishing and collapse. And collapse is what the mythology of progress cannot acknowledge, cannot incorporate, cannot make sense of, except as temporary setback, as aberration, as the exception that proves the rule. But what if collapse is not the exception, but the rule, is not the deviation, but the pattern, is what happens to every complex system eventually, inevitably, necessarily, because complexity is fragile, is requiring constant energy to maintain. And when the energy fails, when the resources are exhausted, when the conditions that allowed the complexity to emerge are no longer present, the system simplifies, degrades, collapses back into disorder. And this is not failure, but thermodynamics, is not moral failing, but physical law, is entropy doing what entropy does. And entropy is not progress, is not moving toward anything, is not improving but is equalizing, is smoothing out gradients, is converting order into disorder, structure into randomness. And life civilization, all the complexity that humans value, is temporary resistance to this process, is local pockets of order maintained at the cost of increasing disorder elsewhere. And the elsewhere is growing, is expanding, is eventually consuming the local, because the second law is inexorable, is not suspended by hope or effort or belief in progress. And so the mythology of progress is fighting against physics, is claiming that the arrow of time points toward improvement, when really it points toward heat death, toward the end of difference, the end of structure, the end of everything that makes progress possible. And the possible is temporary, is the brief window during which complexity can exist, can build, can imagine itself to be moving forward, when really it is just moving, is just changing, is just reconfiguring before the inevitable simplification. And the simplification is what history shows when the mythology is removed, when the narrative of progress is recognized as narrative, as story, as interpretation, because what history actually shows is cycles, is empires rising and falling, is knowledge being gained and lost, is technologies being invented and forgotten, is civilizations reaching heights and then collapsing into darkness from which new civilizations emerge. And the emergence is not progress, is not improvement, is just the cycle continuing, is the pattern repeating, is order arising from chaos and returning to chaos in the rhythm that characterizes complex systems. And complex systems are not stable, are not sustainable, are not moving toward equilibrium, but are far from equilibrium. are maintained by constant input of energy, and when the input falters, the system collapses. And the collapse is not pathological, is not avoidable, is built into the structure, is the natural end of complexity. And the end comes for every civilization, has come for every civilization, will come for this civilization, because the conditions that allow it to exist are temporary, are contingent, are dependent on resources that are finite, on stability that is fragile, on assumptions that are false. And the false assumptions include the mythology of progress, include the belief that things are getting better, that humanity is moving forward, that the future will be superior to the past, and the superiority is measured in terms that already assume progress, is using metrics like lifespan and GDP and technological capacity. And these metrics show increase, show growth, show what looks like improvement, but improvement toward what? Toward what end? Toward what purpose? And the purpose is assumed, is not questioned, is taken as obvious, as self-evident, that more is better, that longer is better, that faster is better. But these are values, are choices, are not facts, are not discoveries, are impositions of meaning onto patterns that have no inherent meaning, and the meaning could be otherwise, could value stability over growth, could value harmony over domination, could value cyclical return over linear advance, and the advance is the mythology, is the story that the Enlightenment told, is the narrative that science and reason and individual liberty would lead to continuous improvement, to the perfectibility of human nature, to the triumph over suffering, over ignorance, over all the limitations that had constrained previous generations. And the triumph has not arrived, has not materialized, because the limitations were not overcome, but were transformed, were replaced by new limitations, new forms of suffering, new kinds of ignorance. And the new is not better than the old, is just different, is just the current configuration of problems that arise from the current configuration of solutions. Because every solution creates new problems, every technology introduces new vulnerabilities, every increase in power produces new risks, and the risks accumulate, compound, create the conditions for collapse, for the failure of the systems that have become too complex, too interconnected, too dependent on conditions remaining stable. And stability is the exception, is the temporary state, is what complex systems move away from rather than toward. Because complexity is dynamic, is changing, is adapting to pressures, and the adaptation is not progress but is response, is the system trying to maintain itself in the face of entropy, in the face of breakdown, in the face of the inevitable simplification. And the simplification is collapse, is the return to less complex states, is what happens when the energy required to maintain complexity exceeds the energy available, and the available is declining, is becoming scarce, is the resource base that allowed industrial civilization to emerge and that is now depleting, is now running out, is now revealing that the progress was not sustainable, was not based on infinite resources, but on finite stores that are being exhausted. And the exhaustion is the end of the mythology, is the revelation that progress was extraction, was the conversion of ancient sunlight into temporary complexity, into the structures that seem permanent, but are actually contingent, are actually dependent on inputs that are ending. And the ending is not failure, but is thermodynamics, is physics, is the way things work. And the way things work does not care about progress, does not care about human narratives, does not care about the stories that civilizations tell themselves to make sense of their existence. And the stories are necessary, are functional, are what allow coordination, are what create meaning, but they are not true, are not describing reality, are describing a constructed reality, a narrative reality, a reality that exists only in the collective imagination and that can be maintained only as long as the collective continues to believe. And the believing is becoming difficult, is becoming strained, because the evidence is mounting that progress has stalled, that the improvements have stopped, that the future is not going to be better than the present. Might be worse, might be collapse, might be the simplification that has come for every other civilization and is now coming for this one. And the coming is not apocalypse, is not the end of everything, is just the end of this particular configuration, this particular arrangement of complexity. And what follows is not nothing but is different, is simpler, is less organized, less centralized, less dependent on the global systems that are currently failing, currently fragmenting, currently revealing their fragility. And the fragility was always there, was always the condition of complexity, was always the cost of building systems that are far from equilibrium, that require constant energy to maintain. And the energy is failing, is becoming unreliable, is exposing the mythology of progress as mythology, as story, as belief. That was never fact, was never discovery, was always interpretation, always narrative, always the imposition of meaning onto patterns that could mean anything, that could be organized into any story, and the story that is told shapes the response, shapes what is seen as problem and what is seen as solution, shapes whether collapse is recognized as collapse or is interpreted as temporary setback, as challenge to be overcome, as opportunity for innovation. And innovation is the god of. Progress is the answer to every problem, is the belief that human ingenuity can overcome any limitation, can solve any crisis, can extend the trajectory of improvement indefinitely. And the indefinitely is the lie, is the impossibility, is the claim that entropy can be defeated, that complexity can be maintained forever, that the conditions that allowed progress are permanent when they're temporary, are contingent, are ending. And the ending is visible in the stagnation of median incomes, in the declining returns on technology, in the increasing fragility of supply chains, in the breakdown of institutions, in the resurgence of tribalism, in all the signs that the center is not holding, that the complexity is too much, that the system is simplifying, whether it wants to or not. And the not wanting is the clinging to the mythology, is the insistence that progress must continue, that the future must be better, that collapse is not possible, not thinkable, not allowable, but the allowable is not up to humans, is not subject to preference, is determined by physics, by resources, by the limits that cannot be overcome through belief or effort or innovation. And the limits are asserting themselves, are becoming visible, are revealing that the mythology of progress was always just that, was always story, was always the narrative that a particular civilization told itself during its particular window of complexity. And the window is closing, is narrowing, is approaching the point where the story can no longer be maintained, where the evidence of stagnation and decline becomes overwhelming, becomes undeniable, becomes the new reality that requires a new story, a new mythology, and the new mythology is not yet formed, is not yet coherent, is emerging in fragments, in the recognition that growth cannot continue, that resources are finite, that complexity is fragile, that collapse is not aberration, but pattern, not failure but phase, not the end but the transition. And the transition is what humans are bad at, are resisting, are denying, because the mythology of progress makes transition look like regression, makes simplification look like failure, makes collapse look like catastrophe, when it is just change, is just the system moving to a different state, a less complex state, a state that requires less energy, less resources, less organization. And the less is not worse, is not better, is just different, is the configuration that is possible given the conditions, and the conditions are changing, are no longer supporting the complexity, are no longer providing the energy, are no longer maintaining the stability. And so the system is responding, is adapting, is simplifying, and the simplifying is collapse, is the end of the mythology, is the revelation that progress was never linear, was never guaranteed, was never more than a temporary pattern that emerged under specific conditions, and that is now ending as those conditions change. And the changing is not stoppable, is not reversible, is the natural progression of complex systems, is what happens when entropy reasserts itself, when the local order that was maintained at great cost can no longer be maintained, and what remains is disorder, is simplicity, is the lower energy state that does not require the constant input, the constant effort, the constant belief in progress, that was never more than belief, was never fact, was never discovery, was always mythology, and mythologies end, are always ending, are replaced by new mythologies that make sense of the new conditions, and the new conditions are simplification, are localization, are the breakdown of the global systems that defined progress, that made progress visible, that created the metrics by which improvement was measured, and the measuring is ending, is becoming irrelevant, because the systems that supported the measuring are fragmenting, are collapsing, are revealing that they were never as solid as they seemed, were always contingent, always temporary, always dependent on conditions that are now changing, and the changing is what humans must adapt to, must respond to, must accept, because the accepting is what allows response, what allows adaptation, what makes survival possible. And survival is not progress, is not improvement, is just continuation, is just the persistence of life in new forms, in simpler forms, in forms that do not require the mythology of progress, that do not assume the future will be better, that do not measure themselves against an imagined trajectory of improvement. And the imagined was always the problem, was always the mythology, was the story that made sense when complexity was increasing, when energy was abundant, when resources seemed infinite, but none of those conditions hold. Anymore, none of those assumptions are valid. And so the mythology is crumbling, is being revealed as mythology. And what is being revealed is not that progress was false, but that it was conditional, was temporary, was the pattern of a particular phase. And the phase is ending, is giving way to a different phase, a phase of simplification, of localization, of the breakdown, of complexity. And the breakdown is not the end, but is transition, is the movement from one state to another, from high complexity to lower complexity, from global systems to local systems, from the mythology of progress to something else, to some other story, some other way of making sense of time, of organizing history, of understanding change. And the understanding is what is needed, is what allows the transition to be navigated, allows collapse to be survived, allows the species to persist beyond the mythology, beyond the belief in progress, into a future that is not better or worse but different, is not moving forward or backward, but is just moving, is just changing, is just the continuation of patterns that have always characterized life, that have always characterized civilizations, that have always involved cycles of increase and decrease, of complexity and simplification, of rise and fall. And the fall is not tragedy, is not failure, is just the other half of the cycle, is the return that follows every advance, is the simplification that follows every increase in complexity, is the natural, inevitable, thermodynamically necessary end of every period of growth. And growth cannot be infinite, cannot continue forever, must end, must reverse, must give way to simplification. And the simplification is happening, is visible, is undeniable once the mythology is set aside, once the belief in progress is recognized as belief, as story, as narrative that served a purpose but is no longer serving that purpose, is no longer making sense of the present, is no longer predicting the future, is no longer functioning as mythology should function, and so it is being abandoned, is being replaced, is giving way to new stories, new frameworks, new ways of understanding time. And the new ways are not yet clear, are not yet coherent, are emerging in the recognition that progress was always mythology, that linear time was always story, that improvement was always interpretation, and that the patterns of history are not linear but cyclical, not progressive but oscillating, not moving toward anything but just moving, just changing, just expressing the dynamics of complex systems that arise and fall, that order and disorder, that complexify and simplify in rhythms that have nothing to do with progress, nothing to do with improvement, nothing to do with the narratives that humans tell, but are just the way things work, the way systems behave, the way entropy plays out in the temporary pockets of order that are life, that are civilization, that are all the complexity that seems permanent but is actually fleeting, actually momentary, actually the brief resistance to the overwhelming tendency toward disorder. And the disorder is not evil, is not failure, is not the end of meaning, is just the default state, the equilibrium, the simplicity that complex systems return to. And the return is not tragedy, but is nature, is physics, is the way things are. And accepting this, accepting that progress was mythology, that collapse is natural, that the future is not moving forward, but is just moving, is what allows the transition, allows the adaptation, allows the species to survive beyond the mythology, beyond the belief that made sense for a while, but makes sense no longer. And the no longer is now, is the present, is the moment when the mythology is crumbling, is being revealed as story, and the story is ending. Not because it was false, but because it was conditional, was applicable only under certain conditions, and the conditions have changed, are changing, are no longer supporting the narrative, are no longer making progress visible, are no longer sustaining the belief, and so the belief is fading, is being replaced by something else, by the recognition that time is not linear, that history is not progressive, that the future is not determined by the past in any simple way, that complexity and simplicity alternate, that rise and fall are phases of the same cycle. And the cycle is what matters, is what persists, is what continues beyond any particular civilization, beyond any particular mythology, beyond any particular belief about where time is going or what the future holds. Because the future holds nothing except change, holds nothing except the continuation of patterns that have always operated, that operate now, that will continue to operate regardless of what humans believe, regardless of what stories they tell, regardless of the mythologies they construct to make sense of their existence. And the existence continues, adapts, persists, not through progress but through change, not through improvement but through transformation, not through moving forward but through moving, just changing, just being what systems are, which is dynamic, unstable, temporary, and always, eventually, inevitably, returning to simplicity, returning to disorder, returning to the state from which complexity briefly emerged and to which it always returns. And the return is not the end, but is the pattern, is the cycle, is the way things work. And working with this, accepting this, understanding this, is what allows humans to move beyond the mythology of progress, beyond the belief in linear time, beyond the narrative of improvement, into a relationship with time that is more honest, more realistic, more aligned with the actual patterns of history. And the actual patterns are not progressive, but are cyclical, are not moving forward but are oscillating, are not improving but are changing. And the changing is all there is all there ever was, is all there ever will be. And the will be is not better, is not worse, is just different, is just the future, is just what comes next. And what comes next is not determined by mythology, is not shaped by belief in progress, is not the continuation of improvement, but is the continuation of patterns, of cycles, of the rise and fall that has always characterized complexity, that has always characterized civilization, that is now revealing itself again, is now becoming visible again, is now showing that progress was always temporary, was always conditional, was always mythology, and mythology's end, must end, are ending now. And what comes after is not nothing but is different. Is the next story, the next framework, the next way of making sense of time, and the sense that is made will not include progress, will not assume improvement, will not project linear advance, but will recognize cycles, will accept collapse, will understand that complexity and simplicity alternate, that neither is permanent, that both are phases, and that the phase of progress, the phase of increasing complexity, the phase of the mythology is ending, is giving way to simplification, to collapse, to the next phase of the cycle. And the next phase is not tragedy, is not the end, is just different, is just what comes after growth, is just the return to lower complexity. And the return is natural, is inevitable, is happening now. And recognizing this, accepting this, understanding this is what allows the transition, what allows the adaptation, what makes survival possible beyond the mythology, beyond the belief in progress, beyond the narrative that time moves forward. Because time does not move forward, time just moves, just changes, just continues. And the continuing is not progress, but is just continuation, is just the persistence of patterns, of cycles, of the dynamics that have always operated and will always operate, regardless of what humans believe, regardless of the mythologies they construct, regardless of the stories they tell themselves, to make the chaos bearable. And the chaos is bearable, has always been bearable, is just change, is just the way things are. And the way things are does not include progress, does not include improvement, does not include the mythology, includes only change, only cycles, only the oscillation between complexity and simplicity, between order and disorder, between the rise that seems like progress and the fall that reveals. It was always just phase, just pattern, just the temporary resistance to entropy that all complex systems represent. And the representation is ending, is collapsing, is returning to simplicity. And the simplicity is not the end, but is the beginning, is the ground from which new complexity might emerge, might rise, might begin a new cycle. And the new cycle will not be progress, but will just be cycle, will just be pattern, will just be the continuation of dynamics that do not care about human narratives, do not respond to human beliefs, do not acknowledge the mythology of progress, except as one more temporary pattern that emerged and fell, that rose and collapsed, that was and is no longer, and the no longer is now. When probability contradicts intuition, there is a game show, a host, 3 doors, behind one door a car, behind the other 2 goats. The contestant picks a door. The host, who knows what is behind each door, opens a different door, revealing a goat. Then offers the contestant a choice: stay with the original door or switch to the remaining unopened door. And almost everyone's intuition says, it does not matter, says the probability is now 50-50, says switching and staying are equivalent because there are 2 doors left and one has the car. But this intuition is completely wrong. Switching doubles the chance of winning, gives a 2/3 probability instead of 1/3. And this is the Monty Hall problem, named after the host of Let's Make a Deal. And it has become famous not just as a probability puzzle, but as a demonstration of how badly human intuition performs with probability, how confidently people cling to wrong answers, how even mathematicians and statisticians initially rejected the correct solution. And this raises deep questions about rationality, about whether humans are capable of probabilistic reasoning, about whether intuition can be trusted in any domain, about what it means to be rational if rationality requires calculations that almost no one can perform. The solution requires seeing that the initial choice had a 1/3 chance of being correct, which means there was a 2/3 chance the car was behind one of the other 2 doors. And when the host opens one of those doors revealing a goat, that 2/3 probability does not disappear, it transfers entirely to the remaining unopened door. So switching gives a 2/3 chance while staying gives only the original 1/3 chance. And this can be proven mathematically, can be demonstrated through computer simulation, can be explained through careful reasoning about conditional probability. But none of this stops people from insisting the answer must be 50-50, from rejecting the correct solution as absurd, from trusting their intuition over the mathematics. And this is not stupidity, not ignorance, not carelessness. This is the way human minds naturally process probability, the way intuition works when confronted with conditional probabilities and updating in light of new evidence. And the fact that intuition gets it wrong reveals something troubling about human rationality, about the gap between how we think we reason and how we actually reason, about the possibility that many of our confident judgments about probability are as wrong as the intuition that switching does not matter. Bayesian epistemology takes probability as fundamental to rational belief, says that beliefs should be assigned degrees of confidence, that these degrees should obey the probability calculus, that they should update through Bayes' theorem when new evidence arrives. And this seems like the right way to think about belief, seems to capture how science works, how learning happens, how rational agents should respond to evidence. But the Monty Hall problem shows that humans are not natural Bayesians, do not intuitively update probabilities correctly, do not automatically apply Bayes' theorem, do not even recognize when a situation calls for probabilistic reasoning rather than simple counting. And if this is true, then Bayesian epistemology is not a description of how humans actually reason, but a normative standard that almost no one meets, an ideal that is psychologically unrealistic, a requirement for rationality that makes rationality impossible for creatures like us. Kahneman and Tversky spent decades documenting the ways human probability judgments deviate from normative standards. The base rate neglect, where people ignore prior probabilities. The conjunction fallacy, where people judge conjunctions more probable than their components. The availability heuristic, where people estimate probability based on how easily examples come to mind. And these are not occasional errors, but systematic biases. Not mistakes that education eliminates, but deep features of human cognition that persist, even in experts, even in people who understand probability theory, even in situations where people are explicitly trying to reason correctly. And this research suggests that human minds are not built for probability, that our intuitions evolved for different problems, for quick judgments in environments where exact probabilities were unknown and unknowable, where rough heuristics that usually worked were better than precise calculations that took too long, and these heuristics still dominate our thinking, still produce judgments that feel right even when they are mathematically wrong. And the question is whether we should try to override these intuitions, should try to become more Bayesian, should train ourselves to calculate rather than intuit, or whether we should accept that humans are not and cannot be perfectly rational in the Bayesian sense, should build theories of rationality that fit how we actually think, rather than demanding we think in ways that are psychologically impossible. The reference class problem makes this even more difficult, because applying probability requires knowing what reference class to use, what group of similar cases to draw on when estimating probability, and there is often no unique right answer. Many reference classes are possible. They give different probabilities, and there is no mechanical rule for choosing among them. Only judgment, only intuition, only the same kind of thinking that gets Monty Hall wrong. And this means that even if humans could perfectly apply Bayes' theorem, even if we could update probabilities flawlessly, we would still face the problem of choosing which probabilities to start with, which reference class to use, which background assumptions to make. And these choices are not themselves governed by probability theory, are not mechanical, are not subject to the kind of rational constraint that Bayesianism promises. And this suggests that probabilistic rationality cannot be purely computational, cannot be reduced to algorithms, cannot eliminate the need for judgment that might be right or wrong in ways that transcend calculation. Subjective Bayesianism tries to handle this by saying that prior probabilities are subjective, are personal degrees of confidence that can differ between rational agents. And as long as priors satisfy the probability axioms and updating follows Bayes' theorem, any priors are rationally permissible. and agents with different priors will converge on the same posteriors given enough shared evidence, or so the theorem says. But this convergence can take a very long time, can require more evidence than is ever available. And in the meantime, agents with different priors will reach different conclusions, will make different predictions, will act differently, and there is no rational way to adjudicate between them. No standard that says one set of priors is better than another. No requirement beyond internal consistency, and this seems too permissive, seems to make rationality trivial, seems to allow anything as rational as long as it obeys the probability calculus. And conspiracy theorists obey the probability calculus. They just have different priors. They assign high probability to things most people assign low probability to, and they update on evidence in their own way. And by subjective Bayesian standards, they might be perfectly rational, just starting from different priors. And this cannot be right. This is not what rationality means. There must be some constraint on priors, some requirement beyond consistency, some standard that distinguishes reasonable from unreasonable starting points. But what that standard is, how to specify it, how to justify it without circularity, these questions have no clear answer. Objective Bayesianism tries to solve this by saying there are objective priors, that some probability assignments are privileged by logic or symmetry or information theory, that the principle of indifference or maximum entropy or some other principle determines what priors rationality requires. But each of these principles faces problems. The principle of indifference leads to paradoxes when applied to continuous quantities or overlapping partitions. Maximum entropy requires choosing a measure, and different measures give different entropies, and none of these principles seems to capture what we pre-theoretically think rationality requires. None of them vindicates our intuitive judgments about which beliefs are reasonable. And this suggests that the project of grounding probability in pure logic or symmetry has failed, that probability is not a priori but depends on empirical facts, on the actual frequencies in the world, on the causal structure of reality. And this leads back to frequentism, to the view that probabilities are objective features of the world, are long-run frequencies or propensities or chances built into the physical processes. But frequentism faces its own problems. The reference class problem returns, the problem of single cases where frequency makes no sense, the problem that different sequences can have the same frequency but seem to have different probabilities, and the debate between subjective and objective interpretations of probability remains unresolved. Remains one of the deepest puzzles in philosophy of science and epistemology, remains a place where intuition gives conflicting verdicts, and mathematics does not uniquely determine the right answer. The Monty Hall problem can be generalized, can be seen as an instance of a broader phenomenon where updating on evidence is counterintuitive, where the correct probability depends on assumptions about the process that generated the evidence, about whether the host had to open a door with a goat or could have opened any door, about whether the host knows where the car is or is opening doors randomly, and changing these assumptions changes the correct answer, changes whether switching is advantageous, and this shows that probability is not just about counting possibilities, but about modelling processes, about understanding the causal structure that generates observations, about getting the model right before applying the mathematics. And humans are bad at this, bad at seeing which model applies, bad at noticing when assumptions have changed, bad at tracking the difference between probability given this model and probability given that model. And this is another way intuition fails, another place where what seems obvious is wrong, another demonstration that probabilistic reasoning is hard, harder than it seems, harder than most people realize. The three prisoners problem is similar. Three prisoners, one will be pardoned, a guard knows who but will not tell. One prisoner asks the guard to name one of the other prisoners who will not be pardoned. The guard names one, and the prisoner reasons that his probability of pardon has increased from 1/3 to 1/2, because now there are only 2 prisoners in the running. But this reasoning is wrong. His probability is still 1/3. The other prisoner's probability is now 2/3. And this is the same structure as Monty Hall, the same failure of intuition, the same mistake of thinking that eliminating one possibility distributes its probability equally among the remainder, when really the distribution depends on how the elimination happened, on whether it was random or constrained by knowledge. And the fact that the same mistake appears in different guises, that people make the same error repeatedly, even after being corrected, suggests this is not a mistake about particular problems, but a mistake about how probability works. A fundamental misunderstanding of conditional probability, of updating, of what it means for probabilities to change in light of evidence. Simpson's paradox is another case where intuition fails, where a trend appears in several groups, but reverses when the groups are combined, where a treatment seems effective in every subgroup but harmful overall, where the correct probability judgment depends on which level of description you adopt, which grouping you consider relevant, and there is often no mathematical fact about which grouping is right, only substantive judgment about causal structure, about which variables are relevant, about what the right reference class is, and this is the reference class problem again. The problem that probability requires not just mathematics but modelling, not just calculation, but judgment. And judgment can be wrong in ways that calculation cannot, can depend on intuitions that mislead, can vary between people who have access to the same mathematical facts. And this means that probabilistic rationality is not purely formal, not reducible to following rules, not something that could be programmed into a computer without also giving the computer the ability to model the world, to understand causal structure, to make substantive judgments about relevance and independence, and which factors matter. And these abilities seem to require something like understanding, something like intelligence, something that goes beyond computation in any narrow sense. The Sleeping Beauty problem pushes this even further. Sleeping Beauty is put to sleep on Sunday. A fair coin is flipped. If heads, she is woken on Monday, and the experiment ends. If tails, she is woken on Monday, put back to sleep with memory erasure, and woken again on Tuesday. And when she wakes, she knows all this, but not what day it is or how the coin landed. And she's asked what probability she should assign to heads. And one argument says 1/2 because it is a fair coin, and her evidence does not distinguish heads from tails. And another argument says 1/3 because there are 3 possible wakings: Monday heads, Monday tails, Tuesday tails, and she should be equally uncertain about which one she is experiencing. And both arguments seem compelling. Both seem to capture something right about probability, but they give different answers, and philosophers have divided into halfers and thirders, have written papers and books arguing for their position, and no consensus has emerged, no decisive argument has appeared. And this suggests that probability itself is ambiguous, that there is no fact of the matter about. What probability means in cases like this, that different probability concepts give different answers, and there is no neutral standpoint from which to say which concept is correct. And if this is true, then rationality does not uniquely determine belief, does not provide the kind of objective standard that Bayesianism promised, allows for rational disagreement, even given identical evidence and identical priors in some sense. And this is disturbing, suggests that rationality is weaker than we thought, less constraining, less objective, more dependent on choices about how to frame problems and which probability concept to apply. The fine-tuning argument in philosophy of religion uses probability reasoning that many find suspicious, claims that the probability of a life-permitting universe is extremely low on naturalism, but not as low on theism, and therefore the existence of a life-permitting universe is evidence for theism. And this argument has the structure of Bayesian inference, has priors and likelihoods, and posteriors, but the probabilities involved seem impossible to specify, seem to require knowing about the space of possible universes and the probability distribution over them, and whether such probabilities even make sense. And skeptics argue that the argument trades on intuitions about probability that are as unreliable as the intuition that switching does not matter in Monty Hall, that it smuggles in assumptions through choices about reference classes, that it treats unknown probabilities as if they were 50-50 when there is no justification for this, and defenders argue that this is the only way to reason about such questions. That probability is the language of uncertainty, and if we cannot use probability, we cannot reason about unlikely events at all. And both sides seem right in some sense. Both seem to be pointing to real problems, and the debate remains unresolved because there is no agreed standard for when probability reasoning applies, for what makes a probability assignment reasonable, for how to choose reference classes in novel situations. The anthropic principle raises similar issues. The observation that we exist as observers places constraints on what we can observe. We cannot observe universes that do not permit observers, and this truism has been turned into arguments about probability, about whether observer selection effects should change our credences, about whether the fact that we are here is evidence for multiverse theories or fine-tuning or something else, and different formulations of the anthropic principle give different answers. The self-sampling assumption says you should reason as if you are a random sample from all observers. The self-indication assumption says you should favour theories that predict more observers, and these give conflicting recommendations, give different probabilities for the same observations, and there is no consensus about which is correct, no compelling argument that one captures rationality and the other does not. And this is another instance of the general problem, that probability reasoning requires background assumptions, requires choices about how to set up the problem, and these choices are not dictated by probability theory itself, are not mechanical, are not subject to the kind of objective, rational constraint that would make probabilistic epistemology a complete theory of rational belief. The possibility remains that human intuition about probability, despite being systematically wrong in many cases, is right in some deeper sense, is adapted to a different kind of rationality than mathematical probability captures, is tuned to ecological rather than abstract problems, to frequencies encountered in real environments rather than to single-case probabilities in artificial puzzles. And Gigerenzer has argued exactly this, has argued that humans are better at frequency reasoning than probability reasoning, that framing Monty Hall in terms of frequencies rather than probabilities makes the right answer intuitive, that many of the biases Kahneman and Tversky documented disappear when problems are presented in ways that match our evolutionary history. And this suggests that the problem is not with human rationality, but with the mismatch between how probability theory frames problems and how human minds naturally frame them. And if this is right, then the solution is not to train people to be more Bayesian, but to recognize that formal probability is one tool among many, appropriate for some contexts but not others, and that intuitive reasoning has its own logic, its own standards, its own domain of applicability, and trying to replace it entirely with formal calculation would be a mistake, would lose something valuable, would sacrifice the kind of quick approximate reasoning that actually works in most real-world situations for the sake of precision that is rarely achievable and often not worth the computational cost. Consciousness all the way down. There is a view so strange, so counterintuitive, so apparently absurd that most philosophers dismiss it without argument. The view that consciousness is not something that emerges in complex biological systems, but is fundamental to reality itself, that electrons have experience, that atoms feel, that rocks possess some primitive form of awareness. And this view is called panpsychism, and it has been held by philosophers from the pre-Socratics through Leibniz and Spinoza to contemporary thinkers who argue that panpsychism is not absurd but necessary, not a failure of reason, but the only solution to the hard problem of consciousness. The only way to explain how subjective experience arises in a physical universe. Because if consciousness is not fundamental, then it must emerge from non-conscious matter. An emergence of this kind seems impossible, seems like magic, seems to violate everything we know about how properties arise from components. And panpsychism avoids this problem by denying the premise, by insisting that consciousness does not emerge because it was there all along, present in some form at every level of reality. And if this seems crazy, it is only because we have inherited assumptions about matter being dead, inert, purely physical, in some narrow sense that excludes experience. But these assumptions are not forced on us by evidence, are not required by physics, are philosophical additions that might be wrong. That might be the source of the hard problem rather than constraints on its solution. The hard problem of consciousness, formulated most clearly by Chalmers, is the problem of explaining why there is something it is like to be a conscious organism, why physical processes in the brain are accompanied by subjective experience, by qualia, by the felt quality of seeing red or tasting coffee or feeling pain. And this is distinct from the easy problems, the problems of explaining how the brain processes information, how it responds to stimuli, how it controls behavior, because these are problems about function and mechanism, problems that neuroscience can address through standard scientific methods. But the hard problem is different, is about the existence of experience itself, about why the physical processes do not happen in the dark, why there is an inner life, a perspective, a what it is likeness, and no amount of information about neural firing patterns or computational processes seems to explain this, seems to bridge the gap between objective physical description and subjective felt experience. And this explanatory gap has led some philosophers to conclude that consciousness cannot be explained in physical terms, cannot be reduced to brain processes, cannot be naturalized, and this leads either to dualism, the view that consciousness is a separate substance that interacts with matter, or to panpsychism, the view that consciousness is a fundamental feature of matter itself, present at every level, and panpsychism has seemed to many the less radical option, the one that preserves physicalism while acknowledging that physicalism must include consciousness, must expand our conception of what matter is rather than adding a separate mental substance. Nagel argued that the subjective character of experience is not captured by any functional or behavioral or physical description, that there is something it is like to be a bat that objective science cannot access, that the first-person perspective is irreducible to third-person description, and this does not force dualism, does not require that consciousness be non-physical, but it does require expanding what we mean by physical, recognizing that physics as currently formulated describes only the relational structure of matter, only how things interact and behave, only the extrinsic properties, and it leaves the intrinsic nature of matter unspecified, leaves open what matter is in itself apart from its relations. And this is where panpsychism enters, suggesting that the intrinsic nature of matter is experiential, that what it is like from the inside is consciousness or proto-consciousness, that the same entity can be described from the outside, in terms of mass and charge and spin, and from the inside in terms of experience. And these are not two substances, but two aspects of one substance. And this is Russellian monism, the view that physics describes structure, and consciousness describes the intrinsic nature that realizes that structure. And this makes consciousness fundamental without making it supernatural, integrates mind into nature without reducing it to mechanism, preserves the insights of both physicalism and the irreducibility of consciousness. But panpsychism faces a devastating objection: the combination problem, the problem of how. Micro-experiences combine into macro-experiences, how the consciousness of electrons and atoms and molecules adds up to the unified consciousness of a human being. Because combination seems impossible, seems to face the same kind of explanatory gap that emergence faces. Because if each particle has its own experience, how do those experiences combine into a single unified experience? Why is there one stream of consciousness associated with a brain rather than trillions of separate microconsciousnesses? And saying they combine does not explain anything, does not tell us what combination means for consciousness, does not give us any idea of the mechanism or the principles that govern it. And this is the hardest problem for panpsychism. The place where the view seems to fail, seems to offer no advantage over emergence. Because combination is just emergence under a different name, is just the same mystery relocated from the relationship between non-conscious matter and consciousness to the relationship between micro-consciousness and macro-consciousness. Goff and others have tried to solve the combination problem by distinguishing different senses of combination, by arguing that phenomenal combination is different from physical combination, that consciousness combines holistically rather than additively, that the right model is not addition where parts contribute independently, but something more organic where parts are transformed by their relations to wholes, where the micro-experiences are modified by being part of a larger system in ways that create genuinely new experiences at the macro level. But critics argue this just pushes the problem back, just replaces the mystery of emergence with the mystery of holistic combination. And we still have no account of how it works. No principles that predict which combinations of micro-experiences produce which macro-experiences. No explanation of why human brains produce unified consciousness, while rocks do not. And without such an account, panpsychism is just a label for the mystery rather than a solution to it. Coleman proposes that combination happens through overlapping wave functions in quantum mechanics, that when particles become entangled, their wave functions overlap, and their experiences blend into a unified experience. And this would give a physical mechanism for phenomenal combination, would explain how micro-experiences unite into macro-experiences through a well-understood physical process. But this proposal faces problems. Problems about whether entanglement really produces the right kind of unity. Problems about whether quantum mechanics applies at the level of neurons and brains, or only at the micro level. Problems about whether experiences can really blend the way wave functions superpose. And most philosophers remain unconvinced, remain skeptical that quantum mechanics solves the combination problem rather than just relocating it to a different domain. The boundary problem is related, the problem of where one conscious subject ends and another begins. Because if consciousness is present at every level, then why is there not one unified cosmic consciousness? Why are there separate subjects at all? Why does my consciousness end at the boundary of my body rather than extending to include everything? And panpsychism seems to have no principled answer, seems to allow for arbitrary boundaries, seems to make the existence of separate subjects as mysterious as the existence of consciousness itself. And this is another way the view fails to explain what it set out to explain. Another place where it encounters problems as hard as the ones it was meant to solve. Leibniz had a version of panpsychism. His monads were simple substances that had perception and appetition, that experienced the world from their own perspective, and he argued that complex beings were aggregates of monads, that each monad mirrored the entire universe from its own point of view. And this avoided the combination problem by denying real combination, by making each monad fundamentally separate, by explaining apparent interaction through pre-established harmony rather than causal connection. But this solution seems even more mysterious than the problem, seems to multiply entities and mechanisms beyond necessity, seems to replace one hard problem with many harder problems, and few contemporary panpsychists follow Leibniz down this path. Few are willing to accept the metaphysical extravagance his system requires. Strawson argues for panpsychism on the grounds that emergence is impossible, that you cannot get something from nothing, that if consciousness exists in the world, then it must have been present in the fundamental constituents of the world, must have been there from the beginning, because otherwise its appearance would be unintelligible, would be brute, would be the kind of emergence that violates the principle that effects must be contained somehow in their causes. And this argument has force, has intuitive appeal, captures the sense that consciousness is too radically different from non-conscious matter to emerge from it. But critics respond that emergence is ubiquitous in nature, that liquidity emerges from molecules that are not liquid, that life emerges from chemistry that is not alive, that many properties of wholes are not properties of parts. And if these emergences are possible, then why not consciousness? Why should consciousness be special? Why should it require fundamentality when other high-level properties do not? And Strawson's response is that consciousness is categorically different, that it is the only thing we know from the inside, that its emergence would not be like the emergence of liquidity, but like the emergence of existence itself. And this cannot emerge because emergence presupposes existence, and consciousness is a kind of existence, is the only kind we directly know, and so it must be fundamental. Tornoni's integrated information theory is sometimes interpreted as supporting panpsychism, because it says that consciousness is identical to integrated information, that any system with sufficient integration of information is conscious to some degree, and this would mean thermostats and atoms, and even individual electrons have tiny amounts of consciousness, have experience proportional to their integrated information, and this seems to support panpsychism, seems to make consciousness ubiquitous, but Tornoni himself resists the panpsychist interpretation, argues that most simple systems have essentially zero integrated information, that consciousness requires a specific kind of information integration that only complex systems like brains achieve. And the debate about whether IIT supports panpsychism turns on technical questions about how to measure integration, about what counts as information, about whether the theory is giving metaphysics or just correlation. And these questions remain unsettled, remain contested, remain another place where intuition and formalism diverge. The idea of proto-consciousness tries to soften panpsychism, tries to make it more palatable by saying that fundamental particles do not have full consciousness, but have some precursor of consciousness, some primitive form of experience that is to full consciousness, as charges to electromagnetism, a property that can give rise to consciousness without being consciousness itself. But this move seems to undermine the whole point of panpsychism, seems to reintroduce the emergence problem at a different level, because now we need to explain how proto-consciousness becomes consciousness, how the primitive forms combine and develop into the rich experiential life of humans. And this is just the hard problem again, just the explanatory gap relocated. And if proto-consciousness can do this, then why cannot non-consciousness do it? Why is proto-consciousness needed at all? And the answer seems to be that proto-consciousness makes emergence less mysterious, makes the gap smaller, but critics argue it just replaces one mystery with two: the mystery of consciousness and the mystery of proto-consciousness. And we are no better off than we started. James believed in a kind of panpsychism, believed in a pluralistic universe of experiences that combined and separated in various ways, believed that consciousness was not confined to brains, but was present wherever there was activity, wherever there was process, wherever there was something happening. And this fit his pragmatist philosophy, his rejection of rigid categories, his emphasis on process and relation over substance. But he never worked out the details, never solved the combination problem, never explained how his mind dust could aggregate into the unified streams of consciousness that characterize human experience. And his view remains more suggestive than systematic, more a gesture toward possibility than a worked-out theory. Whitehead developed an elaborate process philosophy where experience was fundamental, where actual occasions were drops of experience, where reality was constituted by moments of subjective feeling that perished and were superseded by new moments. And this was panpsychist in spirit. Though Whitehead resisted the label, and his system influenced many later philosophers, influenced process theology and ecological philosophy, and anyone who found substance metaphysics inadequate. But it also suffered from obscurity, from technical terminology that made it inaccessible, from a Baroque complexity that seemed disproportionate to the problems it solved. And while Whitehead's insights about process and relation and creativity remain valuable, his full system has few adherents, and his approach to consciousness has not solved the hard problem in ways that convince skeptics. The objection that panpsychism makes consciousness too cheap, too ubiquitous, too divorced from its connection to intelligence and behavior and biological function is answered by panpsychists who distinguish between consciousness and the various functional roles consciousness plays in humans, between bare experience and the kind of sophisticated, self-reflective awareness that humans have, and they argue that simple systems can have simple experiences without having thoughts or beliefs or desires or any of the cognitive machinery that humans possess, that consciousness comes in degrees, that there is a spectrum from the minimal experience of an electron to the rich inner life of a human, and this avoids making rocks intelligent while still allowing them some form of experience, but it also makes the view less testable, less empirical, less connected to anything we can observe or measure, because if consciousness is present everywhere, but only manifests in behavior in complex systems, then how do we know it is there in simple systems? How do we distinguish panpsychism from the claim that it is as if simple systems had experience even though they do not? And this is the problem of panpsychist metaphysics. It makes claims that seem empirically empty, that make no difference to what we observe, that cannot be confirmed or disconfirmed by evidence, and this makes many scientists dismiss the view as unscientific, as metaphysical speculation disconnected from empirical inquiry. Yet panpsychism refuses to die, keeps returning, keeps attracting new defenders, and this persistence suggests it is responding to something real, some genuine difficulty in explaining consciousness within a purely mechanistic framework, some intuition that consciousness is too fundamental, too irreducible, too different from everything else, to be just another emergent property like liquidity or temperature. And whether this intuition is trustworthy or misleading, whether it points toward truth or just reflects the limits of human imagination, remains one of the deepest, unresolved questions in philosophy of mind and panpsychism. Despite its problems, despite the combination problem and the boundary problem and all the other difficulties, remains a live option, remains a view that serious philosophers take seriously, remains a possibility that cannot be ruled out by current evidence or argument. And this says something about the state of consciousness studies, about how far we are from understanding what consciousness is, how it arises, why it exists, and whether we will ever have answers that satisfy both our scientific standards and our philosophical intuitions about what makes an explanation adequate.